morning, Jamie.
Good morning. How is everyone doing today?
Great.
Are you having a wonderful time so far at the forum? I'm about to disappoint you. I really apologize. This, as great as the title and the abstract of this talk was, it's probably will be considered by most of you more of an open source 101. But that's because that's what my day-to-day job is. We talk about technology often, as we see inside large firms and banks, organizations, it sort of bubbles from the bottom up. But as I have conversations, not only with those conversations from developers, from technical leads, but also at the executive level, right? Managing directors, CTOs, CIOs, they don't have the answers to all of the questions that they need. So part of my job is to better inform developers and everyone who knows open source what the actual answers they need to be able to give to make open source be successful in their organizations. So I'm not coming here to give the golden answer or the single silver bullet that's going to allow open source to spread throughout banks and spread throughout regulated industry quick and easily. But hopefully I'm going to reduce a lot of the barriers and time to get it moving. Right? Again, from my perspective, I spend so much of my life and my conversations deep in this world, I forget that there are people who say, well, what do you mean my open source code may one day have a security vulnerability? And I need to think about what that's going to mean to my organization. What do you mean that one day I'm going to accidentally leak something externally, and now my managers and PR team is going to come down and say, sorry, no, you're fine. Is going to come down and say, well, you shouldn't be doing this, and you should have a plan for that, so all of a sudden it doesn't get completely rolled back. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is just these answers and these things that we all intrinsically know, but putting them out there almost, if I could take out, and I have before, taken the topics in the slide deck and turn them into a worksheet, turn them into a document to give people and say, like, look, if you can answer all 37 of these slides, all 37 of these questions, your ability to get open source improved in your organization is going to go up 600%. And just answer these questions and we're there. So this hopefully will be a lot of bringing that all together in one place and sort of talking through where I've seen it valuable and where I see it sort of fall apart. So I'm Jamie Jones, Principal Architect at GitHub, based in Washington, D.C. Work with a lot of our most strategic accounts throughout the world, but I use accounts in air quotes because a lot of the people I talk to aren't paying customers of GitHub. They use github.com for free. They do open source, right? To us, they're our customers. To us, they're our users, even though they don't pay us a dime. So I do a lot of work with these organizations. My background is tech lead, software developer, project architect. I left my last company just for this reason. I was consuming a lot of open source code internally and making patches and adding features that I wasn't allowed to upstream. So I'm now maintaining separate forks myself. The community is not getting the advantage of it, and neither me nor my company is getting the recognition for the work that we're doing. I came to GitHub as a way to try to solve that problem at scale, right? No longer as a developer trying to fix my program or my division or my organization, but to be able to talk to CIOs and CTOs and executive directors of Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies to say there's a better way and we should do this differently. I'm GitHub's representative to the FINOS Foundation, so I sit on the board. I work primarily in two major programs or working groups today. One of them is FDX, FinServ Developer Experience, so there's actually a good talk coming up later on today. I should have put a note here to say come to it. It's 2 o'clock or something. It's on the schedule. Yeah, thank you, Mal. I chair the DX working group, so developer experience. A lot of what I'm doing in that working group is literally talking to banks who say, well, we block access to collaboration tools from inside of our firewall, and that includes GitHub. What should I know to come back from legal? And what should you as GitHub know that our legal needs you to do for us to turn this on? I am another person from a bank. And see, we see GitHub issues as messages in a collaboration platform. So we need compliance wording. And we need the ability to approve all external communication before it becomes public. But here's an issue. A GitHub issue is considered external collaboration, external communication. How do I work with legal to get that better situated, or work with you, GitHub, to give us the approval workflow so that we can roll that out? So that's a lot of what I've been doing with the DX working group over the past year or so. I also work with the open source readiness program because the technology goes hand in hand with the policy and the culture and sort of the higher level process. So I'm also do a lot of work with the regulatory compliance Because often we can, just like I mentioned with the issues, the answer is often technical just as much as it is policy, and they go hand in hand. So I'm more than happy to take any questions. Let this be an interactive session because, again, the content is, hopefully you've heard it all before, but my goal was to condense it all into one spot, right? My goal is coming out of this, right? Really get an understanding of all of the different workflows that I see within regulated industries on a day-to-day basis. Talk about, specifically at GitHub, make sure you know of all the sort of key points that I talk to businesses and organizations to take advantage of when meeting these needs. Talk about best practices for open source security. Talk about things to think about when saying compliant. And truly, like almost a one-pager. These are the tools I see. These are the things that's interesting. If you're standing up an open source workflow or an open source process today, these are things that I will give you a shortcut and suggest that you look at. This is just a slide I threw in, but the reality here, right, is we know that software is important in FinServ and FinTech like never before. And open source is the exact same, right? We look no further than JP Morgan open sourcing perspective yesterday. The amount of contributions and collaboration and work that had been into that just as a private project or public project within JP Morgan for the last couple years, that this is really changing how organizations go. Getting more people into open source. I was just having a conversation in the hallway with Toby, and sort of the advantages you get out of using open source and consuming open source, and what it means for businesses who aren't. This isn't a good businesses use open source and other businesses don't. This is businesses who won't be around in 10 years don't use open source. And just like we would never say you can't use software and technology today, we're quickly getting to the point where we're saying if you don't and can't use open source, you will not survive. So I am not, in 5 years, I expect we'll see quotes like this talking about open source the same way. So let's talk about workflows, right? The open source workflow we all want is just you code in the open, right? There's no workflow. It's just you do open source in the open, right? But that's not always the happy state. We see a lot of banks who are like, yeah, that open source thing's scary, so you should do it on your own time. Or we'll look the other direction, because legal and compliance says we don't do open source, we don't code in the open. And we're just going to ignore the fact that 2/3 of our binaries come from open source projects, and 2/3 of our code actually came right off of Stack Overflow. Let's ignore that fact. And if there are upstream changes from this library, we'd happily take them in. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But you're not doing it on behalf of us, right? From a show of hands, anyone here work in an organization that has this strategy today? Yeah, it's real. It's a thing. We see a lot more of this. Like, okay, we'll kind of understand open source and we'll play in that world, but we're going to put a process in place. One of the interesting things working with a non-bank, Adobe, talking to them over the past couple months, they had an open source ingest and publish process that was more or less the equivalent of 60 steps. 60 questions, 60 approvals, whatever it was. There was a lot of things that had to happen to get open source in and open source out. They've luckily been able to streamline that to 13. And if you're using something that's already been approved, you're whitelisted after question 1 because you say, I want to work on Babel or Apache Tomcat or whatever it is. They say, great, we've already looked at this. License is good. Compliance is good. Go have that. And by the way, here's the other 10 engineers at Adobe who are already working on this. Maybe you should go contact them too. So this is kind of more what we see. How many people in the room work at an organization where you have a process for both bringing in open source as well as publishing out open source contributions or projects? Okay. What if we just put a proxy in between all of it? So maybe not use a form, maybe not use a process, or maybe use a process in addition to servers, right? Because our network's locked down, and we have firewalls and things, and that's not going to let stuff go out. But we can create a trusted host, a trusted gateway that all of this can go out through, right? So we're starting to add a little bit of technology into this process, right? It's not just paper forms and pushing things and waiting for approvals. We're adding a little bit of technology here. Anyone in the room in a proxied fashion? Anyone coming to the keynote tomorrow to hear about the proxied fashion? Yeah, you'll hear about this tomorrow.
I had a different form of proxy.
Yeah.
An enterprise paying a third party to do open source changes.
So you're at somewhat arm's distance from the changes going out. Yeah, so maybe a non-technical proxy. I said this is getting a little more technical, or maybe it's getting not more technical. This is where I'm starting to see some firms get to, which is nice, right? Maybe we let you bring in all the open source you need because we realize you need it to do your day-to-day jobs. Now, when that code gets into production, we're going to have a lot of checks and balances on it. And if you want to publish code out to the public, well, of course we need a lot of checks and balances on it. But let's start to streamline the process of you bringing that code in. Anyone working in an environment like this? No? Okay. And finally, this is where I really see us going, right? This is maybe a combination of the proxy, but really making it more technical. I have a wall there, a firewall there. But really it's, what can we automate, right? If our compliance says there's 13 steps that have to be satisfied to get this code out the door, why can't we just automate them, right? You have to have a firm, valid license. Well, we can read the license in your repository and understand if you're valid, right? You have to have technical manager approval. Great, let's look to see if your technical manager has signed off on the project. They have a contribution to it. The pull request or whatever your format is, if you're using other tools, that's taking this code out the door has an actual check from that manager themselves, right? I think this is where we're going. I know at GitHub we're sort of working on things like this. This isn't meant to be a GitHub pitch. But like this is sort of where we're thinking. We want to sort of build that firewall, build that process so that we can insert whatever process your firms require, both for code coming in and code going out, so we can streamline and provide technical solutions for as much of this as we can. And sometimes there's not going to be a solution. Our goal is not to block you from bringing in code or pushing out code. But maybe what we can do is audit the heck out of it. Make it really transparent who did what, when, where, why, and how. Because at the end of the day, we're never getting to zero risk. Even if you had everyone in the firm all the way up to the CEO approve this code going out, you missed a comment buried in some bytecode of some library you included. And some entrepreneur on the web is going to decompile that bytecode, and they're going to find a comment from UBS that says JP Morgan stinks, right, or whatever. We're never going to get to a zero risk environment, right? But we can get to an environment where we manage and have access to the risk that we're accepting, right? So this is really what I'm hoping to get to and what I'm working internally with GitHub and our product people to help get to. My goal with sort of these slides is hopefully if you're in one of those first few steps, right, you're doing open source on your own time, or you have a very heavy process, there are ways that we can move you down the road without getting to code in the open. You know, a lot of another conversation having today was inner source versus open source, right? And is inner source a step on the road to open source? Or is inner source a bastardized version of open source that's holding us back, right? At the end of the day, this is where we want to get to. But there may be reasons that we have to go to some of these intermediary steps to get there. Maybe it's open source. Maybe it's just more compliant open source. But hopefully, I'm happy to talk more about this later. I'm sure any of the speakers, you know, who have experience with this sort of stuff, but really want to help people get to coding the open and using open source faster. Real quick, I'll run through just because you'd be surprised. As much as everyone I run to is, I've had a GitHub account for 8 years. I'm a GitHub expert. Great. How are you using code owners? Well, what's code owners again? Okay, great. So just want to run through real quick some of the things that we use on GitHub that I tend to suggest to solve some of these transparency, compliance, and technology answers. First is vulnerability scanning, right? Turned on by default for all public repositories on GitHub.com, but you can turn it on for your private repositories as well. This is a checkbox you check because you're giving GitHub the ability to read the files in your private repository. We don't do that natively. So if we want to look through your manifest files, through your POM XMLs and your package.jsons and your Ruby gems, we're asking explicit permission to do it, okay? And what we're doing when looking at it is we're able to raise alerts to you, right? This is our goal of shifting security to the left and all that sort of great stuff. Right now we're pulling data out of the NVD. So a lot of the same sources that you get, a lot of the same info you get from White Source and Sneak and Black Duck and these places, The other thing that we're doing is we're mining our own data, right? So as we have pulled in these alerts from the NVD and seen users make changes and fix their security problems, over 5 million in the last year, just on open source projects. We've also noticed where we've seen similar changes and similar fixes and similar commit messages and similar pull requests to data that wasn't in the NVD, right? So we're also servicing within our alerts sort of GitHub source data. And we're working with partners, getting there with like HackerOne and other security working groups for them to add their data that maybe the NVD has rejected in the past. So we're trying to continue to make this a larger subset. I have another slide on vulnerability scanning a bit later, so I'll talk more to it then. Protected branches. If you're using an open source project, you probably never cared, right? Or committing or owning an open source project. It's open, commit, bring your changes. I do tend to point out you can do things like restrict who can merge in the master. You can do things like block force pushes if someone tries to erase all your history. You can add in required status checks, right? Again, this probably seems basic, but there's so many people out there who miss some of this stuff, right? CI has to pass before we can merge the master. Or even what I see is talking about approvals here. We add a step where it's not CI that's approving it. We're using the Jenkins approval plugin so that my technical lead goes in and clicks the button when they're ready to release it to production. You can add in manual steps or external steps as these status checks to truly have a workflow or automated process that meets your actual paper process. So this is sort of when I start talking to companies, it's not just, well, you have CI and static code analysis and vulnerability scanning. Add a status check for your actual technical lead to say this is good to go. Add an actual step for your data center administrator who says, yes, the data center is open for deployments this Saturday between 9 and noon, right? Let them come in, not an email, not some other system, but right where all of your code is where you can audit it, have transparency to when, where, why, and who, as well as let it flow automatically. Again, I mentioned restrict access. Let anyone create all the branches they want and commit all they want. But really protect who can merge the master, especially as we've seen with recent issues with NPM. You just need one person merging code changes into master and that flowing down into the entire ecosystem to create real big problems really quickly, right? So really think about what sort of permissions and restrictions you put in. Oftentimes when I talk to higher level management, open source is the wild, wild west. The Russians are going to come in tomorrow if I open source my code, or the Washington, D.C.ites. I'm from D.C., so I can be the bad guy here. The NSA is going to come and they're going to put backdoors into my code and we're going to bring it into our firm. Well, that sounds bad, but it doesn't have to. You don't have to accept any code from outside people into your project. Just because it's open doesn't mean it has to be, you have to lose control over it, right? So, keep that in mind. Code owners is an example. Again, it was based off of Chrome's owners concept, where you can restrict certain files, certain file types, certain directories to require reviewers to look at those changes. If your open source project has a JavaScript person and a C++ person for the backend and a React person, well, code owners can help you simplify that. All JavaScript gets reviewed by my JavaScript person. All React views and controllers go to my React person, and all backend C++ or C# goes to my C++ person. And I don't have a thing here, but required reviewers is also a thing. Make sure external people have eyes on this pull request. You can use code owners to suggest who that may be. GitHub will also try to make suggestions for you. The last person who edited this file is probably the best person to review it for you, or maybe even the last person that edited this line of the file is the best person to review your change of this line. But use required reviewers in combination with code owners to simplify that process. Clean up after yourself. You have burnt out. Your organization no longer uses this open source repository. You have some options here, right? Transfer ownership. Maybe there's a new organization, foundation, or even just lead developer who should take this over. It's okay to give it up. It's healthier for you. It's healthier for the community. Because at the end of the day, when someone has a problem with this project and it's sitting in the JB Jones Jr. namespace on GitHub, who do you think they're going to email or ask questions to when they have a problem with it? Me. I should just transfer it over to the people who are actually doing all the work on it, or been most recently using it, and let the community truly take ownership of it. The other half of this is archive it. You're not developing it anymore. This was a really awesome API and render display to your Samsung smart fridge that you sent to the trash dump 3 years ago. It's great that you built this code 3 years ago, but it's sitting on your GitHub profile now, acting like an open project, is only collecting vulnerabilities and sending a wrong signal to the community. Archive it. Code's still available. Anyone can still use it, but you're sending the proper signal out to the world. And finally, a bonus. I like to suggest, GPG commit signing if you can. It's not always the most user-friendly. It's not always the most fun. But if you truly want to know that your users who are making changes to your project are who they say they are, and not just someone masquerading behind this name, start looking at different ways you can prove identity onto what your code's doing, right? So this is an example. You can turn on require signed commits, and it won't let pull requests get merged unless someone signed all the commits on that pull request, right? So you get a little bit more control, again, over who's making changes to your code, or at least you think you know who's making changes to your code. So that's sort of the most GitHub-y thing I have. Question?
Oh, sorry, can I just add one? I think
Yeah.
you might have missed two-factor authentication.
Yes.
If you don't protect your identity,
Yep.
and someone steals it, they can get around everything that you've described here.
Yeah. So I thought about putting in two-factor authentication. I don't have a slide at the end. I'm just put out, and it will be available in the next couple of days. So if anyone's interested, I can send you a link to it. I wrote a white paper about what GitHub is doing and sort of these same sort of techniques. A lot of this came directly out of the white paper. What's in the white paper is talking about 2FA and other sort of account protection mechanisms, because protecting yourself is the first step to protecting your open source. The only reason I didn't mention it here is it gets a little tricky from an org or a repo perspective if you can require 2FA. If you're JP Morgan Chase, for example, you can say everyone who contributes into this org can require 2FA. But is that a barrier to entry for your community of someone who doesn't have 2FA, and maybe because they don't have cell phone service or they don't want to use an TOTP token? So the only reason I don't suggest it is much like signed commits, it's kind of, it adds that layer of friction, which may or may not be appropriate for your community.
Yeah, I wouldn't advocate that every contributor
Yes.
have 2FA.
Yep.
It's more,
Oh, people should turn on 2FA. Yeah, general account hygiene, absolutely.
it's the people who have the privileges
Yes.
to merge branches and make administrative changes.
Yes.
Those are the ones that should have 2FA.
Yep. And so there's also reports you can run within your organization to say, like, okay, do these people have 2FA turned on? We let you enforce it at the organizational level, but not at the repo level. So we don't have an easy way to sort of instrument this in the UI, but we do give it to you in the API to get information. That's a really good point.
Yeah, the things in mentioning organisations.
Yep.
So on the debates with, so the organisation in your view, is that the appropriate medium for companies like those we come from?
Yes.
I know that I know a couple that are already Goldman Sachs.
Yep. Yeah, so the question almost becomes, is the proper medium a single organization or multiple organizations? Is Quorum a big enough product and brand that it should be an organization itself? Or should it fall under the existing, organizations from that bank? That's just as much of a branding and marketing and compliance question, as well as a security question. Again, I mentioned 2FA is something you can enforce at the organization level. Maybe Quorum wants to enforce that, but the rest of the projects don't. That may be a good reason to split off into orgs. There's a whole governance discussion I could have on when you should have one org and when you should have 50 orgs. But that's actually a really good point to bring up. But in general, an organization, if you do nothing more, a single organization for your big O organization is the best way to go. Again, talking about open source security and compliance best practices, this should hopefully be old hat for everyone in the room. But I want you to remember, whenever you're thinking about open source, advocating for open source, you're thinking and talking about all of these things, right? Because it helps to paint the big picture. Just like restricting merges paints the picture that, no, not any Joe Blow off the street can make changes in my repo. This helps you say, like, well, no, but our open source process actually has security and compliance built in, right? You want to use dependency management. Use tools that can help this for you, right? Greenkeeper to Pendabot, they go on. But these tools can actually look in your manifest nightly, daily, whenever a new thing gets released and say, hey, there's a new version of this library. You can set it so it updates it automatically for you, or opens a pull request that says, go ahead and accept this and go on about your business. If you want a little bit more control, I've seen people who create their own scripts that sort of do this nightly. So that way they can say, well, I only want to upgrade major versions of this, but all security relevant versions of this, and so on and so forth. So they can sort of instrument this themselves. But really think about dependency management not as a member of your team or as a person in your organization, but as something that tools and robots do for you. Because there's going to be a time where that member of your team is out sick or has left the program, or in reality, we don't really use this code a lot in the bank anymore, so we really don't maintain it. And it's now affected by a 0-day vulnerability that no one's paid attention to. It's a lot easier to accept a pull request or to let that pull request automatically go into your code base and stop being vulnerable than it is to be vulnerable for days, weeks, or months. And eventually give your organization a black eye. When someone complains, I used perspective from JP Morgan, and that's what introduced this dependency that got me breached. That's not the PR conversation you want to have. You'd rather have the conversation of, hey, I'm going to add an integration into my GitHub repo. I think it's going to keep us safer. Is that okay? Good. Container and image scanning. I deal a lot with OpenShift in the Kubernetes world, and this seems to be, when people talk about security today, this is what they talk about. Hopefully the rest of these slides show there's a lot more than this is, but container and image scanning is definitely a thing, right? You want to make sure your upstream images you're using, where you're getting your images from, the registries are all secure and all what you think they are. There are tools out there that do it, right? But my key takeaway here is there's more to security than just container scanning. So keep that holistic view when you're talking and building out your pipelines. Vulnerability data. So I mentioned that GitHub does vulnerability scanning itself, both on github.com and on GitHub Enterprise. We use NVD data as well as our own tools, as well as our own data. But our goal is not to be the best security company in the world. Just like customers ask me, like, well, so is GitHub going to be our security tool we use in the future? No, I hope not. In reality, just like we did with project boards 2 years ago, where we realized that issues weren't really how modern agile teams tracked changes anymore. They're using Scrum boards, they're using Kanban, they're using whatever they are. We needed some basic project board capability. So we built it. And since then, we built an automation to it and built a really rich API so that you can use more sophisticated tools like Rally or Waffle.io or ZenHub or Jira or whatever it is to cover the features we don't. We don't do agile scoring. We don't do burn down charts. We don't do any of this sort of stuff because we just want to provide the bare minimum functionality that an open source team or a new project can get off the ground running. That's our take with security too, right? If you look at all of the vendors, they all say, well, we have hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities and we have different vulnerabilities than our competitors because of this reason. We don't want to get into that arms race and try to have the best threat intelligence. Honestly, your firms likely have the best threat intelligence there is out there, right? You have teams of analysts scoring the internet, scoring the dark web, scoring all of these sort of things to get the most up-to-date vulnerability information you can, right? We don't want to compete with you. We want to provide an API that lets you take those tools and bring it into play and shift security left and all those great buzzwords you hear. So while GitHub has these functionalities, definitely think about bringing in other tools as necessary. I talked to some banks who say, well, yeah, I have all 4 of those tools plus another 10. Because at the end of the day, even if it just brings in a vulnerability data that's like 10 vulnerabilities that the other guys didn't catch, if that stops me from being breached and losing $1 billion a day, it was worth spending $2 million on a duplicative tool because it saved me $1 billion on that day that I would have been breached, right? So don't hesitate to say, GitHub, your vulnerability data is good, but we have bigger problems and you can help us with. That's fine. We're trying to build the API to help you with that. Build often. One of the things I'm reminded about as we talk about build pipelines, I know the build pipelines, when I do my static code analysis and I find my dependency vulnerabilities, that's great when you're building. But what happens when you've stopped managing this project or your team rolls off in the next sprint to the next tool, and you don't build your code for 2 weeks, or 2 months, or 2 years. All of that logic and security you've baked into your build pipeline is no longer running, right? Maybe that's the case for using tools that scan your code regularly, not part of the build pipeline. But if you're not doing that, at least kick off your build pipeline once a week or once a night or whatever, even if you don't deploy it anywhere, at least so it can raise these sort of issues for you. Static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, testing of your code, all of those sort of things, right? Definitely take advantage of all of those tools that you can. I see a lot of SonarQube out in the world, but continue to see more Codacity coming into play. That dynamic code analysis always gets a little bit trickier, just because so many environments, so many browsers, so many runtimes to deal with. But definitely build up as much as you can, because it gives you the assurance that what you're putting out and it's hitting your customers the way you think it's hitting your customers. Document and security and compliance policy. Yeah, so part of this is just understanding what you're doing with your open source, right? We often talk about, like, well, my firm allows Apache 2 and MIT and GPL v2, right? Great, you've spent a lot of time thinking about your license policy. Have you thought about your vulnerability disclosure policy? How do people report those to you? Do they open an issue in your public web tracker? Who triages those? If this is a project that you've sort of left out for the community to maintain, but it's still sitting within your organization, do you have responsibility for, at the end, fixing zero-day vulnerabilities? Really start thinking about, there's more than just license compliance when thinking about your open source. And I'll touch on a little bit more of this going on. The last thing I'll point out, too, are there activity requirements on your dependencies? Do they have to be active at all? Again, I mentioned you can archive repositories. What's your policy on using archived open source? As part of GitHub's sort of looking into the vulnerability and alerting space, we found 90 days to sort of be a magical cutoff. When we alerted projects that they had a vulnerability that had an active commit in the last 90 days, they were like 10 times more likely to resolve that vulnerability than if they didn't. Or do you, as an open source project, will you let yourself depend on stale or out-of-date open source and assume the risks? Do you even realize the risks of an open source project that hasn't had a commit in 6 months is a different risk threshold than one that hasn't had a commit in 6 days? Have you thought about this? Hopefully you have. Hopefully you will now, right? But this is all sort of what we can document and what we can talk about to say, like, yeah, we kind of know what we're doing with this open source thing, and it's really not that scary, and you, bank, firm, should let us do more of this. So just a quick summary again. Tried to pull up a lot of the major vulnerability or tools, security tools I just talked about. These slides will all be available later, but like if there was one takeaway that may help you build out your open source process, hopefully it was consolidating a lot of this stuff in one place. The DevOps industry is very popular right now. There's 3,000 tools that I could have listed here that I didn't. A lot of these tried to come from like real world experience I've seen with customers in this space, open source users in this space. I'd be super interested if there's a tool that you found to be head and shoulders above the rest that's not on this list. I'd love to add it. I'd love to add it to the slides before I distribute them to everyone afterwards. So definitely feel free to grab me later. Also a plug, if you're looking for tools that sort of do this in a prescriptive way, there is the open developer platform that FINOS provides, that you see things like White Source and OpenShift and Travis already included. It's meant to be a prescriptive and configured in a secure way to help you do open source. So just a quick plug for some of the stuff we're doing. So recap, right? We talked about different workflows. We talked about how you can use GitHub to sort of impact some of these workflows and processes, really what these processes are that you can use GitHub to impact, as well as the tools themselves. If I can leave you with a couple of things, it's what I'm calling code thoughts, right? Hopefully one of these is like, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. And if one of these hits, then I feel like I've done my job for the day, right? So of course, the easy one is how are we managing a community? And this seems simple, but I still talk to so many people who say, well, we're going to open source all of these projects. Great. Who's the community for them? Do they already exist today? Do they exist over there on that other project? Are you going to go to that other project and bring them to you? Should you just contribute to that other project instead? What's your strategy here, right? Well, we were just going to open source. You just build it and they will come, right? Well, no, not exactly, right? So what are you thinking about with your community? Again, what happens when someone acts inappropriately? What happens when you have an issue where outside contributors come and flame all of your issues and say very inappropriate things? And someone from the tech press who has an axe to grind, it's like, does insert company here have a insert thing problem? Because we've looked at their online presence as this is the sort of discussion they're having. And you as a community manager are thinking, I'm just trying to create reasonable discourse and give everyone a platform to discuss while not acknowledging some of their negative ideas. But is that how the outside world is perceiving it? More importantly, is that how your executive management is perceiving it? I always suggest have a crisis communication plan in place before you need it.
Is there a way of addressing that problem? So if someone's gone totally
Yep.
fair in the discussion around an issue,
Yep.
we can't just go and delete that, can we?
Well, so you can mark it as spammy, you can mark it as inappropriate. One of the things we released on GitHub.com just last week was the ability to delete issues for just this reason. Typically, we let you collapse comments and mark them as inappropriate so they were not visible to the general community. Now we actually let you delete issues. However, the reality is we've had a lot of open source projects ask us for that capability. There's a handful who say, but our goal is to be transparent. And we don't want to delete issues because there's real-world discussion and real-world reality of we're now going to change our code of conduct because of this thing that happened. But oh, by the way, you can no longer see the thing that happened. Right? So there's definitely mixed thoughts on should you be able to delete, should you as a project delete it, which goes into the question of what's your strategy?
So you can mark comments under an issue as inappropriate
Yep.
as spam, but
Yep.
you can't actually remove them from the record unless you remove the
Yes. So outside users to your project won't see them at all. An admin will see them as marked as spam, and they'll still have it, so the transparency is still there. Yeah, the next question becomes, do you just want to delete the issue in some? You know, and so that's, but there are many open source projects who have asked this. So again, my action to the crowd is, have you thought about this? What is your strategy for it? And where is that line? Do you have a code of conduct? How many times will someone cross that code of conduct before they get banned from your community? What happens when they then come in back as a sock puppet or via another account? What do you do? How do you identify them? Right? These are all like the things to think about as you start going down the path of open source. It's all great when you, as Toby mentioned earlier, people at Trivago say this is why they joined Trivago, because they do open source. People at Facebook say open source is 75% of why they joined. But you have to deal with this sort of stuff too. And everything in the core infrastructure initiative best practice program. If you haven't looked at it, we use it here at FINOS, but it's used in a lot of the Linux Foundation projects and elsewhere. It's really good, sane tips on how to write or manage a productive community. Everything from having a website and a web presence, not just a GitHub repository or GitLab repository or whatever it may be, all the way down to what's your security vulnerability disclosure process? How do you manage severities of those disclosures? And I'm sort of getting ahead of myself because version 2 of this with more security, right, is who secures your project? Again, is it your own internal security team? Or have you thrown this over the firewall now and you assume the community is going to help secure you? When a zero-day vulnerability hits, does the community assume that your vulnerability team is helping you out here? Or do they know that they have responsibility to fix this? How are you managing things like severity? Do you even audit? Do you use external auditors? You probably do for your own internal projects, right? You have multiple auditors come and look at your source code and look for security. Do you do the same for the open source that you publish? If this is your most public vision or version of what your code is, shouldn't you go through at least the same checks you would do for internal code? Do you have incident response? Where do you report? Do you report to the NVD? What the stats show, right, that MITRE itself and Red Hat are the two biggest reporters to the NVD. Does anyone else in this room report vulnerabilities up? Where would you report them if you did? What is it to the mailing list for that language? Think about sort of these problems before they become an issue. And speaking of security release, so the Envoy proxy, again, is another Linux Foundation program that did a lot of work in thinking through sort of their security response and responsibility. It's a really good pattern to follow. And that's it. So you can find me on various methods on the internet. I have a repo. I sort of manage open source docs that talk about tooling, process, culture, basically all the things that I get when talking to customers and try to write down or give them an asset afterwards. So I store a lot of it there, as well as the wiki spaces here for the FINOS Foundation. Love to talk more about this through you, whether through open source readiness or FDX and the DX program. This is sort of what we do on a day-to-day basis, so we're happy to continue these conversations. Real quick, Mal, you gave me the 1 minute sign.
Yeah, well, I'm just conscious about we have 6 minutes break.
Oh, perfect.
Before the break,
The next start.
But,
yep.
You know, if there is any, probably we can get another question.
Yeah, so I'm happy to continue to take questions as much as you need. For people who want to, if people want to grab coffee before the next session, please feel free to leave, and I'll be around all day and happy to answer questions later as well.
Not just in terms of security, you
Yep.
made quite a telling comment on if something's not been committed to for 6 months,
Yep.
not committed to for 6 days, it's
Yep.
a huge difference. And
Yep.
I think I looked at a package on Monday I wanted to implement, and it had been abandoned over a year ago.
Yep.
But if it was never going to work.
Yeah.
And you know, that's one of the quality things you look at. Is this being actively maintained?
Yep. So as being a GitHub employee and doing a lot with GitHub, I'm actually building a GitHub integration that will use our dependency graph and a lot of the information we have. So again, turning on those features allows us to get information out of the API as well. That will provide some of the scorecard health metrics for you about the dependencies in your project. So to give you, because it's not a vulnerability, it's more just, is this acceptable risk? It's more acknowledgement of the actual risk. You are accepting whether you know it or not. So I'm sort of working on ways to integrate that in with GitHub better, as well as other tools out there, WhiteSource, Jenkins, and Travis, and all the other tools that you use.
A like button on GitHub.
Star it. Well, thank you all. Hopefully this seemed very basic, but hopefully everyone got something out of it. And happy to continue talks and hear other venues. Thank you all.